good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told, out of Voice of Radio. So today we need to have a good old chat about Budew, which, yes, is the correct way to say it. And the reason is, it's not because it's number 001 in the set, although that's kind of cool. And it's not because it's the first Budew we've had for like a decade and a half, although that is relevant and we talked about that before. It's because this card is ridiculous. It is ridiculously good, ridiculously playable, and now that it's legal in Japan, we can say with certainty, is seeing a ridiculous amount of play. To the point where it is very literally in like half of decks. The lovely Pokécard book over on Twitter shared this with us. They've been putting together stats from the top 16 decks of City Leagues over in Japan since this became legal. And out of 896 decks, so not a tiny sample size, it appeared in 48.3% of the top 16 decks. That is extremely relevant, and this is just not what we see from random tech Pokemon. We see this from supporter cards and item cards and things of that nature, sure. But tech Pokemon cards? No. This is not what we see from this ever. We need to talk about this. Also, fun little side note, remember there is such a thing as both a Pokeball and a Master Ball Holo Budew. So, yeah. This is actually kind of relevant. The Master Ball Holo Budew right now is the number one Master Ball that isn't an Evolution, Roaring Moon, which is incredibly playable, or weirdly Groudon. Groudon stands out like a sore thumb in this list. I don't know why Groudon, although the Groudon illustration rare has become super popular, so maybe it's just a popularity thing. But outside of Roaring Moon, which is hyper playable, Ancient Box is great in Japan right now, and Groudon, which apparently everyone loves Groudon, and the Evolutions, which come on there, the Evolutions. The next biggest one here is Budew. Like, this is the big one, which is absolutely absurd. That Budew is a very big deal right now. The Master Ball Holo is jumping up in price, and it is seeing a huge amount of play. So we should probably talk about why that is. So, firstly, it's a basic Pokemon, and it attacks for 0 energy. That means that it can be teched into any deck whatsoever. Even if it's a deck that isn't playing any energy, you can tech it in, and you're fine. So the tech ability here is good. But what we've got is, for no energy, free retreat as well also really helps. 10 damage, but on your opponent's next turn, they cannot play any item cards from their hand. What we have here is easy, universal item lock. This can fit into any deck whatsoever. It can be used turn 1 going second, the very first time you're allowed to attack. And then from there, you're just rolling. And it doesn't even really take any effort. One of the amazing things about it being a free attacker is the fact that you don't need a switching card to get this rolling turn 1. As long as you've got a single retreat attacker, you can use your attachment for the turn to retreat, and then attack with Budew because you don't need any energy to attack. So, yes, it's a basic, that's great, but the fact that you can use your attachment for the turn to retreat and then still be able to attack with Budew is a very, very, very relevant thing here. And like I say, it's making its way into like 48% of decks. And the reason is very simple. Like, if we have a look at the metagame here, the metagame, which is essentially, the first few days of Budew, what we can see here is Gardevoir, Dragapult. Well, they're stage 2 decks. Their decks are a little bit slower. They take some time to get rolling. Although they don't use rare candy. They can use rare candy, but you've got Curlier in Gardevoir and Dracloak in Dragapult, and what they have in common is that they're stage 1s with a draw engine. So basically what you can do here is not rely on rare candy, an item card shut off by Budew, and instead go through your stage 1 to give you extra consistency, which you probably want to do anyway, And oh look, they're the Stage 2 decks that are doing really well in the early Budew format. Is that a coincidence? I'm going to suggest probably not. You'll notice that Charizard has fallen off of this list. There's no Charizard there anymore. Where's Charizard gone? Well, Charizard's a deck that really relies on rare candy. Well, that feels like it's probably going to be shut down quite nicely by Budew now, doesn't it? You know, it's a deck that plays like maybe one Charmeleon. And that's like it. So, yeah. They're Stage 2s, your Charizard and your Pidgeot. They really struggle in a situation where they don't have access to their rare candy. Well, looky here. And you see that across the board. The decks that are surviving are the decks that can live without rare candy. Or without item cards more generally. When you're relying on item cards, things get weird. Also, it does make the distinction between item and tool very important. Like Claw, for instance, is actually doing pretty nicely right now. Claw is a real deck that is actually doing really nicely. But I think one of the differences here is that Claw is reliant on the tool, Ancient Booster Energy Capsule, to go on your Brute Bonnet to activate the poison. Which means that, although you'd rather have your items, every deck would rather have your items, you don't lose for not having your items, because it's the tool. Now, if you couldn't have tools, you wouldn't be able to use Brute Bonnet with Ancient Booster Energy Capsule, and Claw would be garbage. But because we brought in that distinction between tools and items a little while ago with Scarlet and Violet, it survived quite nicely. Because make no mistake about it, Budew is everywhere. Now, when I say everywhere, I don't quite mean everywhere. Charizard is not playing it. It doesn't have the room. Arch Aladon is a deck that is generally not playing it. It's just one of those where it's hard to find the room. And that's generally a bit of a theme here. Sometimes it's hard to find the room for these cards. And sometimes it just doesn't fit what you need. You need a bunch of bench Pokemon. And it just doesn't fit in very nicely with them. And that's a little bit sad. Lugia, again, just does not find the room for it. But also, Lugia is a bit of a bench space issue. Because as well as all your support Pokemon, you need to have your 2 Archeops down as early as possible. And then you really need, but well, potentially at least, if you go second, you definitely need a second Lugia for fear of your first one being KO'd before you can evolve. And yeah, Lugia runs into bench space issues here pretty quickly. So, unfortunately, that's not playing it. Quad Thorns, obviously, it's a quad deck. You're not playing anything but Iron Thorns here. So, no, you're definitely not playing this. That would be silly. But I suppose it does at least it's worth mentioning. And then Roaring Moon decks, because they really want to play as many ancient Pokemon as possible. This takes away an ancient Pokemon from their deck, which really goes away from what their deck is supposed to do. So that kind of explains why we're not seeing it in Roaring Moon. But generally speaking, the decks that aren't playing it, it's, I've got a specific thing like a quad deck or an ancient deck and this doesn't fit. I just cannot spare the bench space or the list is really too tight. Because here's a bunch of decks that are playing it. Here's Budew and Miraidon. Although I will say, Miraidon does tend to be a fringe case. It appears in a few of them, but not all of them. Budew in Dragapult to stop those other pesky decks. Budew in Regidrago. Yeah, this is a deck that can use a bit of help. And again, you'll see a lot of these decks that are playing Budew. Gardevoir, another great example. These are decks that need a little bit more setup. So decks that need Eternal 2 to get rolling, Budew is great. It doesn't always shut down your opponent's deck, but it can slow it down long enough for these decks that want to evolve up into your stage 1 and then your stage 2. These decks that don't have explosive starts, Budew can be there to help them buy enough time to do so. We see Budew in Clorf, for instance. Here's Budew in Lost Zone. And Budew in Ceruledge decks. And then here actually is an example of a Budew in Roaring Moon, because again, even in Roaring Moon, sometimes it can be very useful to slow the game down to try and get a bit of extra time to build up your discard pile. Here is another fancy graphic that was put together by Pokécard, and they really are awesome. This shows the adoption rate of these decks. and exactly how many are using them. So if you have a little bit of a look here, you will notice that in Dragapult we got 90% usage. It's everywhere. Whereas if we put it in Gardevoir, it's 80%. Ceruledge, 90%. Clorphy's at 70%. But Miraidon's down to 30%. Doesn't see a huge amount of play. But then with Regidrago, we're back up to 85%. The numbers top to bottom are just going clockwise around the chart here. And then Iron Thorns with Dragapult, it's 50%. Quad Thorns, you're obviously not playing this in there. And what does this mean? Well, firstly, it means Budew is everywhere. And secondly, it means we've got to change the way we play the game. Because let's not undersell this. We have got a basic Pokemon that for 0 energy blocks items. With everything we've got right now, Buddy Buddy Poffin and all the other draw we've got, if you want this turn 1 going second, you're going to have it turn 1 going second. Which means in about half of your games, if you're a deck that relies on item cards and cannot survive without item cards, you can expect in half of your games, turn 1 going second, your opponent is going to block your items. So you've got 1 turn with items but no supporter or attacks, and then no more items till Budew goes down. So you're going to have to start playing really specific anti-Budew counters, or more likely, you're going to have to start changing how you build your deck. Because we saw this previously with Garbodor. Back in Guardians Rising, we got the Garbodor, which did damage based on the number of item cards in your opponent's discard pile. And it was 24 of the top 32 and 6 of the top 8. It was oppressive in how much play it saw and how ridiculous it was for 1 tournament. Because what happened back in Guardians Rising is we all turned around and said, all right, can't go item heavy anymore. And we all rebuilt our decks to play fewer items and to be less reliant on items. And overnight, Garbodor didn't disappear, but it became a lot less good. That's going to be how we deal with Budew here. And what we're going to see is probably very quickly, players are going to start building their decks to rely less on items. Already the top 2 decks are stage 2s with stage 1s that give extra consistency and don't rely on item cards. I think we're going to see a lot more of this going forward. Fewer cards that are desperately reliant on item cards, and decks as a whole rebuilt so that item cards become less important in your deck. Because if you take a deck to a tournament right now that has to get these item cards and doesn't work unless you get your item cards early and the right ones and all of that, you're going to lose. You are going to get wrecked by Budew, and it is going to go very, very badly. So there we go. Turns out the biggest card that's relevant from this set is Budew. And do remember that this is going to be Terrestrial Festival or Prismatic Evolutions in the West. This is going to be the set which is legal for the first time at EUIC. This is going to be the set which changes the metagame for EUIC. Although, just to be clear, it's not actually legal for the first time at EUIC like we've seen from some sets in the past. What I mean is, EUIC will be the first big tournament with this legal. This will be the set that impacts EUIC. And it will impact EUIC. It is going to be a very big deal. Decks are going to have to change. But I've told you all about this now. So now it's over to you guys. Tell me what you think about this Budew. Do you think it is as good as it currently looks, or do you think it's overblown? How are you changing your deck to account for it? Let me know in the comment section. Get us! Be nice! And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at @TheWasi. That's where we talk about Pokemon and a whole bunch of other card games. And please do consider checking out patreon.com/PTCG Radio, where you can support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all kinds of fun things. And get shout-outs on the channel like the lovely Mary Sanders Lazenby, who's been a supporter of ours for a while now and is a very lovely person. So shout-out to them for the support and the loveliness. But by far the most important thing as always, look after yourselves till next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.